Well, good morning, and welcome to the third session of the Idahoans for Openness in Government. My name is Brandon Wolf. I'm the State Controller, and I wanted to welcome you to our third session. Government transparency sessions here in the People's House, this beautiful state capitol, and specifically here in the Lincoln Auditorium. I want to thank all of you who are attending here in person today, and over the 200 plus, we almost have 300 total registered watching online. Speaking of our audio and visual, I want to give a shout out and thank the crew at Idaho Public Television who are assisting today, and the other technical crews here at the Idaho Legislature. Last month, Secretary of State Phil McGrain gave a great presentation on campaign finance and lobby laws and how to look up the data. If you missed the session or the first one on Transparent Idaho, you can go to the IDOG website and view the recorded sessions. I know this will also be recorded today. With these comprehensive training sessions, our whole goal is to continue to educate and share knowledge with Idaho citizens, with members of the news media, and public officials and their staffs regarding the public's rights under Idaho law for access to public records and meetings, the rules, and how to access the information. Today's third session is focused on Idaho Open Meeting Law. The Idaho Open Meeting Law, which was initially created in 1974, was designed to ensure transparency of the legislative and administrative processes within state and local governments. I had a piece here, but it looks like our presenter already has it up, and I don't want to take away from Brian's thing here. But open meetings offer the public a chance to observe the way their government operates and to influence their government in positive and important ways. Closed meetings often can lead to distrust of governmental decisions and acts. And one of my favorite quotes is, quote, "Obscurity is the best friend of conspiracy." What's really going on behind closed doors? To help lead our discussion and make further introductions, I would like to introduce Betsy Russell, the president of IDOG, Idahoans for Openness in Government, and retired and former journalist with the Idaho Press and Spokesman Review. Please join me in welcoming Betsy Russell.
Hi, I'm Betsy Russell. I'm a retired newspaper reporter and the president and co-founder of Idahoans for Openness in Government. IDOG is a nonprofit coalition for openness in government and is affiliated with the National Freedom of Information Coalition, as are similar coalitions in nearly every state. There's more about us at our website, openidaho.org. Our mission is to foster open government supervised by an informed and engaged citizenry. We believe that we all benefit when the public, the media, and the government officials are fully aware of the public's rights to access government information and observe the conduct of the public's business. During our program today, you can submit questions. For those who are here in the room, which are about 10% of our participants for this session, we have nearly 300 people registered total. For those who are here in the room, please write questions on the cards that you've been given. There are more in the back. Hold them up, and a volunteer will come and take them and get them to our moderators to be asked of our presenter during our Q&A portion. For those who are online, please email your questions to idogquestions@gmail.com. This entire thing will be streamed and recorded, and the full recording and PowerPoint will be available on our website, openidaho.org, within a couple of days after this session. You've received several handouts today, a program, a flyer about all four of our sessions this fall, including two that have already concluded, but the recordings are available on our website, and our next one on the Idaho Public Records Law, which is coming up November 28th. You've also received a flyer about IDOG and what we are and how you can join us and help us in our efforts. We hope you will. If you're an attorney, thanks to our partnership with Attorneys for Civic Education, you can receive continuing legal education credit through the Idaho State Bar for participating in today's session. Please sign up on the list in the back of the room, or if you're participating virtually, please email your name, bar number, and email address to the iDog Questions address. We are very fortunate today to be joined by Brian Kane, the former Chief Deputy Idaho Attorney General, who is now the Executive Director of the National Association of Attorneys General. Excuse me. Brian, who is volunteering his time today, holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Idaho in political science and history and a law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School. He served 4 years in the U.S. Army. I should have brought my water up, before enrolling at the U of I. In 2020, he was one of 4 finalists to become Dean of the University of Idaho College of Law. Oh, thank you, Brian. That's him right there. Idahoans around the state have met Brian as he's traveled with former Idaho Attorney General Lawrence Wasden to open government seminars in every region of the state over the past 2 decades, educating and informing local government officials, members of the news media, and the public about how to comply with Idaho's 2 key open government laws, the Idaho Public Records Act and the Idaho Open Meeting Law. He is the foremost authority in the state on those laws. Brian has authored legislation, constitutional amendments, and numerous legal articles. He served as legal counsel to the legislature, the Secretary of State, and the State Treasurer's Office, as liaison between the Attorney General and local, state, and federal governments, and argued before the Idaho Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Brian served with the Idaho Attorney General's Office for more than 20 years before accepting his current position in September of 2022. He now travels all over the country and the world, but fortunately for us, he and his family are still based here in Boise. Before we hear from Brian today, we're going to call on some of our audience members to play parts in an interactive skit about the Idaho Open Meeting Law. Portraying the role of Lucky the Reporter will be Chief Deputy Idaho Secretary of State Nicole Fitzgerald. Playing the 3 county commissioners at breakfast will be Idaho Capital Sun editor Christina Lords, Idaho Statesman editor Chad Kripe, and Idaho Press editor Teddy Feinberg. The scene takes place in a local cafe. Playing the server at the cafe is Scott Graff, communications director for the Idaho State Department of Education. Actors, please come up and take your places. All right. In this scene, we meet Lucky the Reporter. Lucky, please wave at the audience. Lucky just started working for the Daily Splash last week, and this is Lucky's lucky day. Lucky has stopped in the local cafe for a bite of breakfast and gets seated next to the 3 county commissioners. County commissioners, please wave at the audience. Unaware that Lucky is a reporter, they are busy handling the county's business. Action.
Morning, Lucky. Welcome back. Morning, Lucky. Welcome back. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. What do you have today?
I will have 2 eggs over easy, bacon, extra crispy, hash browns, also extra crispy, sourdough toast, and orange juice.
Sounds good. Coming right up.
Thanks.
So, we'll pave County Line Road to Maple before the first frost. You 2 all right with that?
I can go along if we can take it another half mile past Maple. That'll get us some nice pavement in front of my brother-in-law's place.
I don't know, Jerry. The budget's pretty tight. I really think we need to stop at Maple.
Come on, Chris, work with me on this. I think I can help with the zoning problem on that nuclear power plant you want down by the wildlife sanctuary. Nobody needs to know your dad's behind it.
Look, I'm fine with paving County Line Road, and it honestly doesn't matter to me at all if we stop at Maple or go all the way to Elm. What I really don't want is us to get in the middle of this power plant issue. We need to stay out of it and let the Planning and Zoning Commission do its job. What I'm really interested in, though, is what we're going to do about that county prosecutor. I think he's getting a little big for his britches. Maybe he gets a little smarter if we cut 50 grand out of his budget. We should say we had to make the cut to cover paving County Line Road down to Elm.
Okay, good. So, where are we going to build that jail? Is Raylene willing to sell? How much does she want?
Hold it. I am blowing the whistle. Illegal procedure. In Idaho, we have not made it, is this on? Yes, illegal for a quorum of county commissioners to ride in the same car across town to a funeral. But if a governing body does meet outside a posted public meeting and conducts business, hey, like this, they can each face a civil penalty of $250, which they will have to pay out of their own pocket. Got that, commissioners? And if it's the second violation within 12 months, the civil penalty is $2,500. And if it can be proven that they knowingly violated the open meeting law, the penalty is $1,500, even if it's the first violation. Additionally, any action taken at a meeting held in violation of the open meeting law is null and void. The law includes a process by which a governing body can admit and cure a violation. We saw a recent instance of that involving the State Land Board. Brian Kane will be telling us how that works, along with other requirements of the law, in a few moments here. Just so you know, this skit was based, albeit loosely, on an actual event that happened here in Idaho in which a school board got caught doing business at a restaurant. We had a little fun with this scene, but of course, much of what the commissioners did here would have been illegal even if the meeting had been held properly and in public. Let's thank our actors. So, how do we do it right? How do we comply with the Idaho open meeting law and preserve the rights of citizens to the processes of government? Brian Kane is here to help answer this question. Please welcome Brian Kane.
Thank you, Betsy, Mr. Controller, Nicole. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Before I start, I'm an attorney, so I have to offer a disclaimer. None of this is actually a legal opinion or a legal analysis and is not legal advice to any of you specifically. It's a general recitation of the law, and I am speaking on behalf of myself, not my association or any specific attorney general. Now that we've got all of the legal niceties out of the way, we can get down to business. I love this first slide, and I love it for two reasons. First of all, it's kind of the mantra of the Idahoans for Open Government, or the IDOG organization, but it's also the purpose statement of the open meetings law. And so this is what the legislature offered to us, and it's that they don't yield their sovereignty to the agencies so created. The policy of the state is that the formation of public policy is public business and shall not be conducted in secret. To me, that gives a great guiding premise whenever we approach the open meeting law. And the guiding premise of the open meeting law is if there's ever a question in your mind as to whether or not a meeting should be open, we always say, when in doubt, open it up. And so if there's ever a doubt under the open meeting law, should we do this in an open meeting or shouldn't we? The right answer is right there in that public purpose. And I think that, Controller Wolf highlighted one of the more important elements with regard to government. If we're at a moment where we're having a questioning of confidence in government and what government is doing, is the answer to that confidence question to retreat and do more things in secret, or is the answer to be more transparent in what we do? And I think that, to me, I can't tell you how excited I am by the transparency that the Controller's Office has undertaken with regard to the state and local government's finances. Like, that's something that is tremendous, and it's a tremendous resource. And I mean, I will admit, I've gone in there to see who has ordered the most Jimmy Johns and things like that. And it's not because that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Sometimes the very best thing you can do as a government is to have a working lunch. It's there because it takes the mystery out of it. And I think that whenever we have a question of confidence about what government is doing, it's because that question is born out of a mystery. It's born out of we don't know what's happening. And so under the open meeting law, if we embrace the open meeting law as a premise to say, when in doubt, let's have an open meeting law, we collectively are injecting more confidence into the things that we do. And I'll share a personal example with you of where a lack of information creates a dilemma. I have two teenage kids. They have a time to be home. And so if I say, I'd like you to be home tonight by 11 o'clock, if it's 11:05, is my first thought, they're just inconsiderate teenagers that have their own selfish interests ahead of our family collective interests? No, never. It's holy cow, they're in a ditch on the side of the road. They hit a deer. They have a flat tire. They ran out of gas, whatever, right? And to me, I think that we can all share that experience where the lack of information creates that negative inference. And so at times, it can be a little bit difficult because for government, it's counterintuitive to think, oh, if we give more information, that takes away from those negative inferences. And yet the open meeting law and even the public records law and the efforts of the controller and the efforts of the Secretary of State to bring transparency to all these elements of government are actually helping to reinforce that confidence that we have in what we all do. And I think it's important to understand, right? It doesn't mean we're all going to agree on what's done. It's just we'll all know how we arrived at the end of the equation. And if we can see that, we can disagree from an informed platform, which again enhances the collective element. And so as you go through this is a law that you absolutely can lawyer and say, we don't have to open up our meeting or we can go into executive session. But remember that overarching, when in doubt, open it up premise. As we go through this, I've broken the law down into 5 sections. We've got a definitions section, which just tells you what falls under it. We've got a notice and agenda, what is required to provide notice of your meeting and what are the requirements for an agenda in the meting, how the meeting is conducted, executive sessions, and then enforcement. If you stick through the first 4, you really should not have very many issues with the 5th on enforcement. But we'll go through it just to make sure everybody knows what's in there. These are statutes, which means that whenever you have a statute, the legislature gets to say what that definition is. And so if the legislature defines an animal as if it quacks, has feathers, swims, and a beak, and it's a dog, well, for purposes of that statute, it's a dog, even though whatever we commonly know as that doesn't sound like a dog to us, the legislature controls there. And so sometimes folks run into trouble because they'll look at a definition and they'll say, well, that's not what my definition of a meeting is, or that's not what Webster's definition of a meeting is. And it's because the legislature gets to essentially establish the rules of the road. I also want to comment that those rules, because it's the legislature, can sometimes be a little imperfect, which then creates job security for folks like me. So jumping into the definitions, the first premise is a decision, and it's just any determination upon a motion, proposal, resolution, order, ordinance, where a vote is required and there's a quorum present. And so in essence, if you're going to take a vote on something, it's a decision, and it could be on anything. And so, things like approval of minutes, that's a decision. Going into executive session, that's a decision. So those are all examples of things that you may think, oh, we don't need to identify that. Those are all decision points that should be recognized. Deliberations. This is where the open meeting law gets expanded. A deliberation is the receipt or exchange of information relating to a decision. And so to me, what this tells me is if I'm a member of a governing body and we're on the road to a decision, then we have to have that discussion in an open meeting. And so that becomes part of how the application and the reach of the open meeting law expands. This also takes us back to kind of our originating premise, right? When in doubt, open. And so it doesn't include informal or impromptu discussions of a general nature. One of the things that I will tell you is the open meeting law does have a small chicken and egg problem. And the chicken and egg problem is if you think through logically, right, a decision point would be, well, what do we put on our agenda? Right? Like we want to discuss the citing of the planning and zoning permit for this development. Well, do we have to have a meeting to then decide whether or not we put that on the agenda? Well, it becomes inoperable at some point. And so what I like to tell folks is you have this carve out for informal or impromptu discussions. And so if we were going to have a discussion and say, hey, I think we're ready to make a decision on that development, let's get it on the agenda. And somebody says, I don't think we have enough information. I'd like to wait till we hear from so-and-so. That's an okay discussion. Where does that discussion become not okay? If I say, hey, let's get this on the agenda, I'm ready to approve it, right? Because now I've essentially cast my vote. And so if you say, let's get it on the agenda, we're ready to consider it, perfectly fine. If you go that extra step and say, hey, we've got the votes, let's get this on the agenda, that's where the line can be crossed. And so that helps, I think, round that out. The next definition is public agency. This definition is comprehensive. Essentially, if it's in government or tied to government in any fashion, it's a public agency for purposes of the open meeting law. And I want to highlight here the language towards the bottom, the fourth row from the bottom of the definition. Any sub-agency of a public agency which is created by or pursuant to statute or executive order of the governor, ordinance, or other legislative act. And so if your governing body is creating subcommittees to take on work, those subcommittees likely have to comply with the open meeting law because it wraps them in. And so it's not one of those things where you can just push off the hard discussions to someone else to do it in secret. I also would return to the premise that if you create a subcommittee to lock the public out, that's not going to go well. Folks are savvy to those sorts of things, and you'll instead of dealing with the issue you want to deal with, you'll be dealing with the fact that folks are unhappy about how you're dealing with it, which creates its own weather. A governing body, members of any public agency consisting of two or more members with the authority to make decisions or recommendations. This recommendations is key because a lot of times a subcommittee will be making a recommendation to the larger body. And so again, we build in those subcommittees and sub-agencies through these definitions working together. It's also important to note this only covers governing bodies, so it has to be two or more. So for example, do the state controller or the secretary of state have to comply with the open meeting law? No, they're not a governing body. It's the Secretary of State and the controller, right? They're the masters of their kingdom, so to speak. Now, they may sit on boards and have responsibilities that do have to comply with the open meeting law because of they're on a governing body at that point. And a great example of that in Idaho is they're members of the land board, which does comply with the open meeting law because that is a governing body charged with the administration of those resources. Then we go down to a meeting. And a meeting is any convening of a body, any convening of a public agency to make a decision or deliberate towards a decision. So we've now, in the course of defining meeting, built in all of those other definitions. There are two types of meetings, regular and special. A regular meeting is a meeting that occurs in your due course of business. And so, for example, if you're a city council or a county commission, you may meet the first Tuesday of every month. That's your regular meeting. And there's a way under the law where you can say, here's our schedule of all those meetings. Any meeting outside of that parameter then becomes a special meeting. And so that would fall under the requirements for that notice. Out of these definitions, we get a few questions that come up over and over again. And one of them was referred to in the skit. You know, is it okay for a governing body or a board to go to lunch together, or to go to a holiday event or a sporting event, or, you know, an association of counties meeting together? And the answer to all of those questions is yes. If. The if is you can't discuss business there. And that's the real pause point on all of these sorts of things. And to me, it's not a question of can you go to that can you go to that lunch? The question is, can you go to that lunch and not talk shop? And it's harder than I think we give ourselves credit for. Right? This is a little battle between present and future self, if you want to get really deep into it. Because I will tell you, I go to social events. When I go to a social event, invariably, I wind up talking to other attorneys. We talk about, you know, the usual stuff. What are you binging on Netflix? Can you believe what Disney has done to Star Wars? And then the next topic is, so what are you working on? And it's because that's our commonality. And we have to understand that whatever the thing is that we have in common that brings us together, that's our natural landing point when we hit that pause in our small talk. That's the next topic. And so the question isn't, can you go to lunch? The question is, can you go to lunch and not talk shop when you hit that pause point? Do you have another, you know, table topic card or something in your breast pocket that you can pull out and, you know, say, you know, what's your snake story or something like that? And I think that, to me, those are the question marks. By the way, everybody has a snake story, so if you're ever in a jam, that's a great way to get out of it. So then we go down, we have, as I indicated, we have two types of meetings. Regular meetings require no less than 5 calendar day meeting notice and 48-hour agenda notice, which means you have to have notice of your meeting put up 5 days in advance. The agenda has to be ready 48 hours in advance and posted. And you post that at your place of business or the place of the meeting. And you also post it online, which is the next slide. You can also have special meetings. They require at least 24-hour meeting and agenda notice unless it's an emergency. And I want to emphasize that emergency in this context means an exigent circumstance. Right? The floodwaters are rising. The fire is charging down the mountainside. Something happens. It can't be, we forgot to get it on the agenda. And so you have to be able to identify what that emergent circumstance is for an emergency meeting. And that should be fairly straightforward if it's an emergency. You should be able to say it. And again, that's the transparency element built into these statutes. You do have to post it online, and I think that, you know, to me, one of the things that you want to make sure of is whatever your presence is online, you're posting that meeting notice and agenda there. And it can just be a link. It doesn't have to be like a full page sort of thing. You can post, here's our meeting notice, here's our agenda. And a lot of, I've actually observed that a lot of entities around the state do a really good job of posting that notice and agenda online. And I think that that's helped immensely. You are allowed to have an executive session only meeting, and it has to have a minimum of 24-hour meeting and agenda notice. You have to, within that notice, state, this is why we're having an executive session, and this is the provision that we're going to be going into the executive session under. One note I want to highlight is that the press has the ability to contact agencies and say, we want notice of any special meetings. And so anytime a special meeting comes up, if the press has put themselves on the list, the agency has an affirmative responsibility to provide that notice to the folks that are on that list. That's a specific requirement in there. Every meeting is required to have an agenda. You post it with your meeting notice, so place of business, place of meeting, online. You're allowed to make amendments to the agenda. If you're outside of 48 hours, you just post an amended agenda. If you're inside of that 48 hours, you're going to have a motion and adopt essentially a new agenda. And if it's within 24 hours, you would state a good faith reason for why that wasn't on an earlier version of the agenda. And again, it's all to inject transparency in it so that we don't have what I would refer to as like a sandbag item, right? You've got a very controversial topic. You look out, the crowd is thin, maybe the top rabble rouser on that issue isn't present, and you're like, hey, this is our shot, let's do it. And so that it's all designed to inject notice so that folks can observe that. And then the final element that's required there are two other elements required on agendas. The first is all items of probable discussion. And so if you're going to discuss a topic, it has to be on the agenda. The question within the law is what level of detail is required. And I don't have a good answer for you on that. And it's because the law doesn't state how much detail is required. And so, for example, if you have an agenda item that says new business, that doesn't get there. If you have an agenda item that says consideration of curriculum, that probably is legitimate. If it's an agenda item that says development citing, that's negotiable, right? Because if you've got more than one development, if you've got, that could be one where you want to be a little bit more detailed. And so the question mark then is really, how do we convey enough detail to put the public on notice for what they want to observe? And I think that part of it is understanding that as government, we have to, if the public comes to observe what we're doing, their time is just as valuable as anyone else's, right? We all have time in this game, if anybody, and so they don't want to come down to observe something they have no interest in. And so that's one of the trade-offs within the agendas. The other element that's required within agendas is you have to identify action items. And action items have to be identified to provide notice that action may be taken. It doesn't require that action be taken. It just has to be there to show it. A couple of spots where entities often slip up on action items, approval of minutes is an action item, and sometimes they forget to mark that, but you always take a vote, almost always, unless you decide you have to amend them or something and you put it off to another time. And then executive sessions have to be identified as action items because that you're taking an action to go into that session. And so those have to all be there. There is an emergency provision where if you find out at the end, during the meeting or really close to the meeting, hey, we actually do need to take action on this, again, you can provide notice, make a motion, state why it is that it has to be declared an action item at this point, and then take action. A good example of this would be, say you're an entity and you learn of like an employment issue involving somebody during an executive session. You may come out of that executive session and have to take some action. And you could even come out and say, based on the information provided to us in the executive session, we hereby move to take this, we need to take this action, and this will be placed on the agenda as an action item. That complies with all the requirements under the law at that point. And I think that that's one of those things to recognize. All meetings shall be open to the public. And I want to pause here and make sure that one element of the open meeting law is completely understood. The open meeting law guarantees the public's right to observe the meeting. Observe the meeting. It is not a right to participate in the meeting. Now, there are entities that from time to time do have an open forum element within their agenda. And if you have an open forum where all comers can come talk, well, it's hard to turn that off. Boards are allowed to say you get 3 minutes, or we're only going to hear testimony on these issues, right? You can narrow it as a board, but you have to make sure the rules are the same for everyone. When I was with the AG's office, I received an amazing number of phone calls from folks that said, I want to make an open meeting complaint because I went to the meeting and I didn't get a chance to say my piece. That's not an open meeting violation. That may be a political question for the entity, but the open meeting law is only your ticket to the show. And so just as you wouldn't go down to the Morrison Center and jump on stage to sing with King George in Hamilton, the same thing happens within Idaho, right? You just get to see the show. We used to casually refer to the open meeting law as your ticket to the show of government. And I think that's a great way to think about it. You can't hold your meeting any place where discrimination on the basis of race, creed, color, sex, age, or national origin is practiced. I bring this up not because that's an issue in Idaho. The issue in Idaho is sometimes we have smaller towns where there's not a great meeting place. And so folks will say, well, can we have the meeting in somebody's home? Can we have the meeting in somebody's church? And the open meeting law doesn't expressly prohibit that, but one of the questions you have to always ask in those scenarios is that truly open to everybody? Because some folks do not feel comfortable just walking into someone's house. Some folks don't feel comfortable walking into certain religious spots. Those are just things to consider. Not an outright prohibition, something to think about. All meetings can be conducted using telecommunications devices. There are a couple of things I want to highlight here. Number one, if you have an all telecommunications meeting, you have to have a physical location of the meeting with at least one member present so that they know this is the spot where the meeting is taking place, and you don't walk into, some science fiction movie with a black box on the floor in an all-white room. You have to be able to hear the audio. One of the things that we learned coming out of the pandemic is, yes, this technology is great, but it's not infallible. And so if you learn of an audio problem, the best advice that I can offer, recognize I'm not giving advice here, but the best advice that I can offer is you pause the meeting, figure out what the audio thing is, and then pick it up. Don't just bulldoze through whatever the audio problem is, because that's going to generate open meeting complaints, right? That's going to generate folks thinking, oh, they cut the audio out so we didn't hear what they were really doing. Those are all the things that create dilemmas. If you're on Zoom, I cannot, this is not an open meeting law requirement. This is a confidence in government recommendation. If you're on the board, have your camera on. And it's because, again, right, if you turn the camera off, what are you doing? Folding laundry and watching the game? I mean, and I think that, that's the thing that people will take away from that. And so I can't stress enough, cameras on to inject confidence into what you're doing. The other element I want to make sure you're aware of is, we are in an era of these being ubiquitous, and I want to make sure you can't text with your board members during the meeting. And I want to make sure, for two reasons. Actually, there's three reasons. Reason number one, if you text among them, well, then you're deliberating outside the context of the open meeting law. So that's a violation. Reason number two, if you're transacting public business, those texts are probably a public record. And so they will have to be disclosed if somebody sees it. And then reason number three, there are zero surreptitious texters in the world. It is a known fact that nobody stares at their crotch that long. And nobody looks down and starts laughing. And so I just offer that to you as pragmatic advice to know people are going to see it. And now, are there going to be times when maybe you do need to get a text, right? You've got maybe a daughter that's about to go into labor or some other thing. Sure thing. But those should be the exception. And again, if we're thinking about the open meeting law in terms of confidence with government, right? Folks come there to see you engage with them. not to see the top of your head or the back of a laptop screen. Eye contact is a big part of injecting that confidence. And so one of the things that I like to recommend to folks is don't bring your devices. Like, give that 2 hours or whatever, that hour, 100% to your constituencies and your efforts. Sure, there's, as I said, maybe every now and then you've got a reason why you've got to bring it in. But for the most part, you can offer up that time to your folks, and it's going to pay a return. If you think about what we're dealing with as far as confidence in government right now, one of the primary considerations within that element is whether or not certain constituencies feel like they are heard by government. One of the best ways to ensure people feel heard is to make eye contact. There's other steps, but that's a completely different presentation. But to me, I think it's really important that you understand the dynamic of devices within those meetings and how they affect and impress upon folks what your engagement level is as a member of the public. Think about it in these terms as well. Someone cares so deeply about an issue that they come down to testify on something in front of a board. Well, if they don't see you as they're testifying, do they think that you're taking that issue that is so important they showed up? Do they think that you're even giving it half of the attention that they think it deserves? And I think that becomes part of our, if we approach this as, when in doubt, open it up. This is how we bring transparency and confidence. That's part of that equation too. And how do we make all of that stuff work? You have to provide written minutes of your meeting. And written minutes means in writing on paper. And so I know in this day and age of paperless society, all that means is you got to be able to hit print somewhere and say, here's our minutes. I know that a lot of folks have minutes on their websites, which I think is fantastic. Make sure that at some point, if somebody wants a physical copy, you can give them a physical copy. That's a long way to say just recording your meeting, like if you have a Zoom recording of your meeting or a YouTube recording of your meeting, that's not the minutes. And so if somebody comes into a government office and says, I want your minutes, and you say, oh, here's our YouTube channel, that doesn't comply with the law. When I was with the AG's office, we actually went all the way to the Idaho Supreme Court to determine that written minutes means in writing on paper, which you're probably saying, how could you make a Supreme Court case out of that? Never doubt the efficiency of lawyers. The minutes have to have a minimum, and it has to have all members present, all motions in their disposition, and the results of all votes. People always ask, what should we put in our minutes? And I always say you have to have that minimum, and then you also want to reflect the general tenor of discussion. So it doesn't have to be a statement by statement, but it should say, we discussed the citing of this development. Objections were raised by a number of constituents. You may want to say, here's what the objections were, or you may want to just say objections were raised. The board discussed it, and then it was moved by Council Member Smith, seconded by Council Member Jones, 3-2, whatever. A good example, if you ever want to see what good minutes look like, are actually legislative committee minutes. They do a fantastic job, and if you're ever like, hey, are we hitting the mark here? If you are in that ballpark, you should have 0-minute problems. So now we go to executive sessions. And executive sessions are permitted under the law. And an executive session just simply is where the public is excluded and the board gets to discuss very specific topics. When you go through the law, the topics are specifically identified. In order to go into an executive session, it has to be under one of the exceptions enumerated in the law. You have to have a 2/3 roll call vote, and then you can go into executive session. We get several questions that come up over and over within executive sessions. Question number one is who gets to be in the executive session and who decides who goes into the executive session? I'm going to answer those in reverse order. The board decides who goes into the executive session. The board decides who needs to be in the executive session. And so if the board is like, it's just going to be the board, we're not going to have our clerk or our attorney in there, that's the answer. If the board is like, we want to have our clerk, we want to have our attorney, we want to have these 3 witnesses from the public in there, and we want to have this member of the press in for whatever reason, that's the answer. That doesn't happen very often. In Oregon, it does. And it's because you have, in Oregon, they have a watch function that is at play there. I want to give a few cautionary elements about executive sessions. Executive sessions are most successful when you embrace the concept of small. They should be small in number, meaning you shouldn't have a lot of executive sessions. You shouldn't have a lot of people in them. So small in number. Small in time. If the executive session goes on for a long time, it's very likely you're going to drift off topic, which is a violation of the open meeting law. And then you want to have narrow topics, small in topics. So if you have small number, small time, small topics, your executive session should be just right. And I want to give you an admonition. The whole point of an executive session is that you need to keep certain information confidential. One of the rules of confidentiality is best expressed by Ben Franklin. Anybody know what Ben Franklin said about keeping a secret among 3 people? The only way you keep a secret among 3 people is if 2 of them are dead. I'm not advocating killing anyone. So that's not the answer here. The key here is the more people you bring into that executive session, the more difficult it's going to be to keep whatever it is that you need to keep confidential. Which gets to my next question. What recourse does a board have if a member of the board goes into the executive session, walks out of the executive session, and tells the press everything that just went on? There's none. That's not an open meeting violation. And actually, that's probably a good check, built-in check on whether you should be in executive session or not. But there is no penalty for somebody to come out of an executive session and say to the press, hey, here's everything we talked about. Whatever, I don't know why we were in that executive session. That happens in Idaho. It happens across the nation, actually. And I think that, to me, that's one of those other things to always keep in mind. So when we go into executive sessions, you'll see one of the easy ways to look at executive sessions is they require specificity. So every one of these executive session exemptions looks big, but it really hones in to a single element. And I'll use the first one as an example. When hiring a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent, the respective qualities of individuals are to be evaluated in order to fill a particular vacancy or need. There are 2 specifics that leap from that definition. Specific number 1, you identify the position, right? We're hiring for new city attorney. And then you've got individuals, and we're interviewing candidates A, B, and C. You can always point to those specifics. It should never be, we're going in to figure out whether or not we need to hire a city attorney. Too general. You see the difference there? And I think that's one of the things to always keep in mind. And it tracks through each one of these elements. When you go to the next one, evaluation, dismissal, or disciplining of. These are specific complaints about a specific person. We had we had an open meeting complaint one time because a county commission, which shall go unnamed, had an executive session to figure out why the public was so upset with them. I was like, I feel like you've answered your own question. But anyway, to me, that's not a valid way to go into that's not a valid purpose for an executive session because there's nothing specific there. Now, could they go into an executive session because a single member of the commission was being complained of? Yeah, probably. And I think that that's the thing is, as you go in, there's a tendency to want to generalize. That tendency towards generalization should be a built-in check as you evaluate whether or not to go into an executive session. to acquire an interest in property. You should be able to identify whatever the parcel is. You don't disclose it, but you can say parcel A or parcel B. Records exempt from disclosure. There should be records in existence before you go into the executive session. It's not to go into the executive session to create the records, which again, that's another call that we have had over the years. Preliminary negotiations. We go down to legal counsel. And to me, you should be able to identify a specific claim or case that is either already been filed or imminently to be filed. And so, for example, if you have a snowplow truck that drives over a Pomeranian, and you know you're going to get sued over that Pomeranian, you may want to go in and discuss that claim and figure out, hey, is this something we want to litigate or do we want to negotiate? That's, again, specific incident, specific purpose. Same thing with risk management, right? It's a specific claim that you can identify. The challenge here is sometimes folks want to go in to just discuss generally things like claims or generally things like litigation. It should be winnowed to very specific elements in each one of those. Returning now to kind of our overarching theme, when in doubt, keep it open, the executive session provisions say these are to be narrowly construed. And so that's another watchword. When you're in executive session, you can't go into executive session and then change the topic to one that you haven't already identified as going into executive session. So for example, say you're in executive session to discuss a claim. And say it's a claim that you have I don't know, maybe a drunk construction worker who's endangering the lives of people. You can't then decide, oh, well, we're going to go in to hear the complaints about whether or not this person actually is, if that wasn't already on your agenda. If you wanted to do that, you'd have to come out, add it to your agenda, and then go back in, assuming it meets all the other requirements. You also have to be very careful of what I call executive session drift. And so say you're in very validly to consider the hiring of a city attorney. And let's say the city attorney has a very aggressive salary demand. And you say, oh, we can't meet that salary demand because we don't have the money. And somebody says, oh, well, why don't we have the money? Well, our revenues came in below projection. Well, why did our revenues come in below projection? And do you see what's happened? We're now no longer talking about the hiring of that person. We're now talking about the budget and what's going on with the budget. And that's how easy it is. And so one of the things that I always recommend to folks is make sure you have somebody in that executive session that will keep you on track. And this is a lot harder than you think because folks have to understand that they're empowered and enabled to bring these topics up. It's very easy for us in the abstract to say, oh, just go in and bring us back to topic. The question mark is, what is the reaction within that meeting when somebody brings it up? Is it, oh, here we go again? Or is it, hey, thanks, that's really helpful? Because one of those answers is going to make sure you do stay on track and people do speak up. And one of those answers is going to create a scenario where folks are very hesitant and reluctant to speak up. I will give you a very quick tip here. One of the most dangerous things to assume is that in any meeting where everyone is silent, they all agree. In fact, that's actually a warning sign for any meeting if everybody's silent. And so that's the same thing applies in this scenario. You can't have an executive session to take final action or make a final decision. This is one of those spots where it's really good because one of the questions we always get is, well, how do we know when we're done with our executive session? And the answer is, how would I know? I mean, I'm not in your executive session. Or if you want it to be more finite, a beautiful lawyerly, it depends, works. To me, I always think about executive sessions as there's a point in every meeting where you've kind of said what needs to be said and folks are either repeating it or they're kind of looking around like, what are we still doing here? Those are great indicators that you're done. There's also nothing wrong with an executive session only being 5 or 10 minutes. In fact, I would recommend that you have shorter executive sessions, because the longer you go in the executive session, two things are going to occur. As the length of the executive session goes on, it's more likely to drift off topic. And it also, because you're covering more topics, becomes more difficult to keep the confidentiality of it. And so you want them to be brief in time. There are also minutes required of executive sessions, and the minutes are very brief. It just says, we went into executive session under Idaho Code section 74206(1)A. We discussed the filling of this vacancy and then adjourned from the executive session. That's all that's required. It doesn't give up anything about what went on in that executive session, but it allows folks to understand. One of the practices that I recommend doing within executive sessions is to timestamp your executive session. So for example, and this is really important if you go in for more than one thing. So say you have to go in to hire somebody, hear a complaint, and acquire a piece of property. What you can do is you can say, we entered the executive session to consider the hiring of X position at 6:02 p.m. We finished the discussion of the hiring at 6:07 p.m. and embarked on the discussion of hearing the complaints about employee B. That discussion finished at 6:20 p.m., and then we began the discussion of acquiring our interest in real property. That discussion finished at 6:35. The beauty of that is you have given up no confidential information. Like, you have protected everything that needs to remain confidential, but you've created a measurement for the public to say, hey, these folks are going into the executive session, they're dealing with their business, and they're getting out. Like, it's not going on forever. We know roughly how long it took. And it injects a level of transparency that brings confidence to what you're doing within those meetings. That's not a requirement of the open meeting law. That's just a good, solid practice to address things where questions come up over and over. There is a requirement for negotiations. I know there are a number of entities that have labor union negotiations. They have to be conducted in open session, but there's also exemptions built into the law, which involve considering of offers and counteroffers, or receiving certain specific information about employees. Good news, everybody. You made it to enforcement. So within enforcement, number one, failure to comply can render the decision null, which means it has no effect. There's a tight timeline on that. You have to bring the allegation of the violation within 30 days, and it's because we can't jeopardize an entire budget over that, because those things there's a lot of moving parts within government, and so if you wait 6 months or a year, well, how do you undo certain things? And that's why the timeline is tight to have an action declared null. The element of this is that something has to occur for it to be null, meaning you have to either bring an action and have a judge say, yep, this violated the open meeting law, that action is invalid, or the board has to recognize it and say, you know what, you're right, we violated the open meeting law, that we're rescinding that decision. That decision has no effect at this point. It's not that you just jump up and say you violated the open meeting law, that decision has no effect. It's not self-executing. Something has to occur for that to take effect. If you violate the open meeting law, there's a series of fines. There's any violation whatsoever is a $250 personal fine, $1,500 for knowingly participating, and $2,500 for repeat violations. I want to stress that the violations are personal to the individual board member, meaning the government entity can't cover the fine for them. It comes out of your specific back pocket or purse or whatever, your Venmo. When it comes to enforcement on the state level, the Attorney General enforces with regard to public agencies of state government. The prosecutors have it with regard to local government within their jurisdictions. And then there's a third category where any person affected by the decision can bring an open meeting complaint. And so and I say this because we would always get folks that were very upset because they'd call us and we couldn't take action. And I'd say, well, you can take action. And sometimes they'd be mad about that, and sometimes they'd be like, oh, I didn't realize that. But there is a built-in citizens enforcement mechanism to this statute. Similarly, if you call about a local entity to the AG's office, the law requires them to refer you back to the prosecutor's office. And it's because of the way that the law sets out who enforces what. Essentially, we're all supposed to stay within our respective lanes. There is a cure provision. And under the cure provision, there's two ways to fix it. The first is you as an entity recognize, hey, we messed up here. We didn't get our notice right, or we didn't do something right. We didn't have this identified as an action item. We were in executive session for the wrong reason, or for too long, or we drifted, whatever it is. You as the board have the ability to identify it. The other way is a citizen can identify it. Say, hey, I think you guys messed up the open meeting law. Do you want to reconsider or redo your meeting? And the cure is just that. You rescind your action and you acknowledge, hey, we made a mistake, and then you redo the meeting. And I want to offer to you two scenarios. In scenario number one, we had an entity that violated the open meeting law. It was pointed out to them, and they said, yep, you're right. We violated the open meeting law. And they made a public statement, they re-noticed their meeting, they redid everything, just the way that the law allows for them to do. And there was very little news coverage of that. I think Betsy had a small blurb back when the eye on Boise was alive and well. By the way, I want to make a note about Betsy. Like, if this is her in retirement, I can only imagine her unretired. But I think that, to me, there's a lesson there, because there's another entity that violated the open meeting law. And this is when I was with the AG's office. And we called that entity and we said, hey, we think you violated the open meeting law. If you will let us come train your folks, and you say, hey, we violated the open meeting law, we'll call it good. They said, we didn't violate the open meeting law. So we said, we're going to have to file a complaint. Are you sure you want to do this? Yep, file your complaint. We didn't do anything wrong. So I want to make sure you know that the minute we at the AG's office filed our complaint, that's front page news. It's also back page news, because the editorial writers, they love this stuff. Like it writes itself for them. So you've got that element. Then the judge issues her decision, and she says, yep, you violated the open meeting law. Well, that's front page news, back page news, right? This is good stuff. They appealed it. The Supreme Court, the Idaho Supreme Court says, you violated the open meeting law. And it's front page news, back page news. And then there's a follow-up article on, guess how much they spent defending this open meeting law, or trying to defend this open meeting law violation. And so I put those two scenarios in front of you because the open meeting law allows for a very gracious off-ramp if you're confronted with an open meeting violation. The tough part is sometimes the hardest thing in government is to admit that government is wrong. And we probably all have a personal story or two where we've had that experience with government. But I think that this is a great example of where, hey, we've created a great avenue here for you. And again, the goal of the open meeting law is not litigation. The goal of the open meeting law is compliance. And by allowing for this cure, the legislature is incentivizing compliance. It's also recognizing that Idaho has very few what I call professionals in government, right? We're largely folks that volunteer to run or just volunteer to serve on a board. They don't even run, they get appointed. They don't get paid anything. There's a tremendous amount of volunteer government within our state. Should we expect them to be experts in everything as volunteers? Or is it like, hey, you're going to make some mistakes. Here's a way to acknowledge you made the mistake, get training, get better at it, and not do it again. And so this is a great example, I think, of the legislature's recognition and foresight of those elements. And so I offer that to folks to say, hey, this is a great opportunity for you. One of the things that we have, we've got a flow chart for the curing process. These are all taken from the Attorney General's manuals, and so Attorney General Labrador has the open meeting manual. He's got the public records manual. Within General Labrador's open meeting law manual, there is a series of checklists for regular meetings, special meetings, executive sessions. There's forms for executive session motions, as well as how to, if you need more guidance on how to amend an agenda. And so if you're unsure, there's a tremendous resource there for you to just grab a hold of. And as a citizen, it's a great resource too to kind of say, hey, are they doing things the way that they should? Or I don't understand why they did something this certain way. And you can look at it and say, oh, now I get it. And with that, that is our open meeting law, and I am here to answer questions.
We have a ton of really good questions already submitted. If you have questions here in the room, please hold up your card and a volunteer will come and take those from you. We have one down here in front. And our moderators, Brandon Wolf and Nicole Fitzgerald, will be posing the questions to Brian. We'll get to as many as we can.
Thanks, Betsy, and thank you, Brian. One of the questions that came in was, you talked about all these things with the open meetings. The legislature, they have a little bit of a different spin on that, and all of a sudden meetings change, things are posted, not posted, and this. Do they have different things that apply to the legislature?
Yes, they do. And the legislature, both chambers, both the House and the Senate, have specific rules with regard to their committee meetings within the House rules and the Senate rules. And it outlines how their meetings are held, when they can have executive sessions, and all of those different sorts of requirements. And so they do have their own rules of the road. And if you think about it in terms of how quickly the legislature moves, because it's a part-time legislature for only 3 months or so, depending on the year and the mood. If they had to have 5-day notice, I don't know that they could ever get everything done. And so I think that, to me, it makes sense that they have their own set of rules. And they do, in my estimation, and having advised them for a few years, they work pretty hard to follow those rules as far as how they do things. Now, are there odd days? Yep, but there's odd days everywhere.
What should a citizen do if an agency's minutes are incomplete, seriously delayed by 3 or more months, or lack the detail that you mentioned in your presentation, like X person voted yes, Y person voted no?
So there's a couple of questions in there, Nicole, if I can break them down. And the first question is, when should minutes be available? And the answer is a very lawyerly, it depends. The law says the minutes should be available within a reasonable time following the meeting. Well, in Idaho, we have incredibly different levels of sophistication of boards. We have boards that meet once a quarter. We have boards that meet every single day. If you're a board that meets once a quarter, it may take a month to get your minutes out. If you're a board that meets every single day, well, those minutes should probably be coming out very regularly, like 2-3 days tops. Within that, it's also important to recognize draft minutes are public records. And so the minute pen hits paper or processor hits Word, those minutes become available. Now, you can stamp them draft and say they haven't been approved, but those should be available at that point. And then the third question that was built in there was, well, what if the minutes are incomplete? To me, that's a great opportunity to make a complaint, an open meeting law complaint, and say the law requires who was present, what the votes were, and what the motions and resolutions were. This isn't here. Can you fix it, or do I need to make a formal open meeting complaint?
Brian, one of our favorite organizations is homeowners associations. Are HOAs subject to these open meeting laws, and also maybe like not-for-profits organizations?
No, they are not. And it's because, if you remember, I'm going to actually go back to the slide here because I think it's perfect visually. So if you remember, the law applies to public agencies. So a homeowners association is actually a private group of like-minded, some days, and very not like-minded other days, individuals who all own homes together in a community, and they say, here's the rules of our roads, so to speak. And it's a private group. And it's the same thing with a nonprofit, right? They're organized under 501c3. They have paperwork that they file with the Secretary of State, the IRS, but they're a private group that has come together for to advance some sort of private purpose that may have, a public impact, but it is a privately held group of folks. And so it doesn't fall under the open meeting law. I will say, however, if you care to read closely homeowners association documents and whatnot, there's often provisions about meeting requirements and whatnot within them. But you might have to get your magnifying glass out.
All right, this is a two-part question. So the first part is, when packets of information are given out ahead of open meetings to board members, should that information legally be put on the agency's website also?
So the open meeting law only refers to what happens within the meeting, not necessarily the materials distributed with it. And so if it's not either the agenda or the notice, there isn't a distribution requirement. Now, those documents very likely would fall under the public records law, and so someone could ask for them. I think that, if you think of if you're one of the folks that thinks of government as a customer service enterprise, you might want to make those available fairly routinely, posting them on a website. I mean, they're good practices. They're not necessarily legal requirements.
And the second part of that is, would it be illegal to tell the board members to keep that information secret in advance of the meeting?
I don't know. I don't know that would be illegal to tell them to keep certain information secret ahead of the meeting. I mean, if it's a public record, it's a public record. And so they can't, if you're advising them for whatever reason, don't discuss this, there may be reasons for that, and there may be reasons why that's a bad idea. Again, under the open meeting law, that's probably not a violation. Now, could it be a violation under some other law? Maybe. But I'm not 100%. That's a very nebulous question. There's a lot of mystery built into that question.
Well, Brian, here's another fun one. So using our first skit, there's 2 local counties, maybe ones that are close by here, that have hired a chief operating officer to help with daily business of the commissioners. Can they have meetings with him off record, jointly or individually, regarding county business to develop a work product for a future decision that would be agendized legally in the future? So in other words, decisions will be noticed and held in compliance with the law, but the work is completed behind the scenes using the COO.
My recommendation would be, if the group of commissioners is getting together to deliberate, which that sounds a lot like deliberation, just having the chief operating officer in the room doesn't make it not a meeting of the county commissioners, especially if a quorum is present. And so my advice would be that probably should be open.
All right, another question about texting. May a government board member text a former member of the same board in the audience during a meeting for advice on how to proceed or deliberate?
So again, there's no prohibition on that, although that would probably be a public record. Actually, that would definitely be a public record.
You touched on this one a little bit, Brian, and I think maybe just to drive this home. So this question, my city is a strong mayor and a council of 6. Is it permissible to have a subcommittee of 3 council members post the meetings with an attached agendas? For instance, a public works committee, which would then make recommendations to the full council.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a great example of a classic subcommittee. And my recommendation would be notice those up as open meetings, and do everything above board. One of the other things, Nicole, I want to return to your last texting question very briefly. I want to make sure that text you could consider that text to be a violation of the open meeting law as a deliberation. The dilemma with it is it's not a deliberation among the board, it's a deliberation with a former board member. And so it may not be an open meeting law violation, but would definitely, it sounds to me, be a public record. And there's some nuances to these things that we can't let escape us, or as I put it, job security for folks like me.
So how about Public party county central committees, do they have to follow open meeting laws?
Political parties do not fall under the open meeting law. And this is a question that comes up very frequently. But again, they're their own entity. They're distinct. They wouldn't fall under this definition of public agency. And so political parties, I know that there are folks that have lots of ideas about them, but it's not we don't regulate the political parties. They do their own thing.
Brian, you talked about this, about one of the key things is to make notice to the press of agendas and minutes, especially if it's within that 48 hours, that 24-hour time period. But how do you define members of the press? Are they self-declared bloggers, YouTubers? Yeah,
that's a great question, and I don't have a definition at this point in time. To me, I've always approached it as, essentially an email list. You get a list of folks that say, hey, we want to get notice of it. And if they've got an email address, you just put them all on the same email and send it out, and easy peasy. But if a board wants to get into those distinctions, I think that's up to the board.
So this is a question about hybrid meetings. We are a board of 3 volunteers. We have contracted 2 positions, a communications and outreach coordinator and a lake manager. If we do Zoom meetings, is it acceptable to designate the communications and outreach person to be in the physical location, or does it need to be the board member?
So under the law, the law says it has to be a board member or executive director or similar position. And the question mark then, that's a good question for whatever the entity's attorney to say, does that qualify as a similar position under the law? Your best bet is to just have a board member be present. Like, you'll never have any questions in that scenario. As you get further away from the board, the questions will become more prevalent and more difficult to answer.
Brian, for the meetings that allow public comment in person, are there any requirements that remote comment must also be allowed? If not, it seems it's not equitable or open to all.
So again, this is not an open meeting law requirement. But if a board opens up for public comment, it becomes really tough to say, well, we're only going to take public comment from the folks that are there physically as opposed to the folks that are remote, if that's part of the element. And so, that's one, talk to their attorney, but my recommendation would be, once you open it, it's open to all. Keeping in mind, you do have the ability to put parameters on it, like no more than 3 minutes, or we're only going to stick to topics on the agenda tonight.
My city has a strong mayor and a council of 6. Is it permissible to have a subcommittee of 3 council members post the meetings with attached agendas? For instance, a public works committee, which would then make recommendations to the full council.
Yes, that sounds like a good subcommittee practice, if I understand that correctly.
Maybe, Brian, if you could expand on the committee rule. Like, this one says, I'm a member of a school board and have been assigned to committees where we discuss and make recommendations to the full school board for a decision. Should those meetings follow the same rules as a full board meeting? It sounds like we should.
Yeah, it sounds like that you're creating it as a sub-agency of the board. And I think, to me, one of the critical distinctions is, if you have a board that creates a smaller group or a side group that's then going to bring that issue as a recommendation back to the full group, it's in your best interest to follow the open meeting law at that situation, because what you're doing is you're really offloading a lot of the deliberation, part of the decision-making process, to that subgroup. And so since you're offloading that deliberative process, you want to make sure that that remains open so that then when it comes in front of the board, folks understand how the decision was arrived at.
So this one has to do with public comment where the public is just observing. I want to know, if you attend a meeting as a participant and don't agree with the decision or an action, what can you do?
Vote. I don't mean to be flip, but I think that that's part of government, right? Is that government makes decisions that we don't necessarily agree with from time to time. And I think, you know, again, when we think about the open meeting law, there's a mouse problem in here. When we think about the open meeting law, right, one of the things that the open meeting law helps us to address is what I call the fundamental fairness problem of government, right? When we interact with government, we know that we're not going to agree 100% of the time with their decisions. The trade-off is that when we do interact with government, we will be treated fairly and we will be heard. If any part of that equation gets off, well, then the confidence in the decision-making erodes. And so if the board has completely complied with the open meeting law and you're unhappy with the decision, that's government. That's the system working. And sure, you can be frustrated. And I can't tell you the number of legislators and city council members and board members and everything else. They're in their seats because they were upset by a decision that a previous board made and spurred them into action. Like, I can't think of a more robust example of our system at work.
Brian, I think our time's pretty close here, but one thing maybe you could talk about, one that I deal with or coordinate with from a land board perspective, is serial meetings.
Oh.
Can you touch on that for a second?
Yeah.
Because I think that's important.
That is important. And I think that that's a great question. And I need to update my notes. So one of the things you have to be wary of is anytime you create a quorum, you create a meeting. And so, for example, if, and I'm going to use one of the examples from our question. Say you've got a chief operations officer that sends out an email to your full council or your full board and says, here are the 5 items on the agenda. Here's the information regarding these items on the agenda. If you have any questions, get back to me. Well, somebody then hits reply all and says, I don't know what these people think by thinking we're going to vote for this. It's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Number one, that's a public record. Number two, you've just created a deliberation. And so that's an open meeting violation because of that element. When you get into larger boards, right, you don't create a quorum if you're a board of 7 and you talk to a single other person. The challenge comes, you talk to that single other person and then you talk to one more and they talk to one more. Now you've created that quorum and you've deliberated through that quorum. And so then you violated the open meeting law. And so you have to always be aware that as you play that game of telephone, you may be creating a quorum. And so that becomes a real unnecessary thing. I think I share a frustration of a lot of people that like the worst invention ever was reply all. But it is a very common way to violate the open meeting law. And again, recognizing that mistakes happen, if somebody does reply all, one of the easiest and quickest ways to address that is to hit print and bring it to the meeting and say, hey, we made a mistake. This was a reply all. Here are copies. If anybody wants to see what we said, it's right there, and clean up that violation immediately so that it doesn't slow down your board and you can keep going. People are going to make that mistake. It's almost impossible not to.
This is kind of a follow-up maybe for a final one along the same lines. Some of our larger counties have professional staff, even to the length of chief operating officers and so on. How much business can be conducted by those chief operating officers with the board members or the commissioners in advance of any open meeting? And could we get into a situation where all that work is done off the record and not actually in the public meeting? And wouldn't that violate the open meeting law?
I mean, it could. I think it depends on how that business is conducted and what the scope of it is. You know, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is if the board has approved, like on a macro, we are going to build this highway, and then they work with the chief operating officer to kind of put all the little things in place to build the highway, that's probably okay. If it's the opposite, we want to build a highway, and the chief operating officer meets with them and says, here's the parameters, and here's what we want to do, and what do you think of this? And they're like, oh, this sounds great. We'll vote to approve it. And so there's some elements there that change the answer. And I think, Betsy, to your foresight, yeah, there are absolutely scenarios where we can run into problems with that. And, to this point, the law hasn't really been tested in that direction so far. But I think there's a cautionary element that should be shared with boards who use those sorts of systems. All right, well, thank you.
Please thank Brian Kane for this excellent presentation. Those were all such good questions, and there were more, even some we didn't get to. For some, we may be able to respond by email, and I will try to do that. We are now ready for our final skit, and I would like to call up our actors. Once again, we have Lucky the reporter, portrayed by Chief Deputy Idaho Secretary of State Nicole Fitzgerald, and playing Trusty, the city clerk, is Andy Snook, attorney for the Office of Governor. Please come on up and take your places. It may seem like just a few minutes since we met Lucky the reporter. Lucky, please wave at the audience, who had stumbled upon an illegal meeting of the county commissioners at the local cafe. But 6 months have passed, and a lot has happened. Lucky wrote the story about the deal to pave the road to the commissioner's brother-in-law's place, revealed that the chairman's father is the secret owner of the proposed nuclear power plant by the wildlife sanctuary, and of course, made a big deal out of the illegal meeting at the cafe. The commissioners were each required to pay a $1,500 civil penalty for knowingly participating in an illegal meeting, and are barely on speaking terms with the prosecutor, who referred the complaint to the Attorney General. Lucky received the prestigious Golden Gotcha Award from the State News Editors Association and the cold shoulder from just about everyone at the county. Lucky also developed a healthy skepticism about just what our public officials might be up to. Now, Lucky's on the City Hall beat. This scene happens in the hallway outside the City Council chambers. Mayor Luther Burbank and the Watertown City Council are in the chambers, meeting with City Attorney Abe Lincoln. They've convened in executive session behind closed doors to consider Litigious Lyle's offer to settle a lawsuit. Litigious Lyle is the guy who freaked out when a city snowplow leveled his rose bushes, we heard about this before, and nearly crushed Pookie the Pomeranian, causing Pookie to have recurrent nightmares to this day. Lucky the reporter finds Trusty the city clerk in the hall outside the meeting room. Action.
They still in there talking about Lyle's lawsuit?
Hi, Lucky. Yep, the city council is still meeting, and no, you can't go in there.
I don't know about these closed meetings, Trusty. Seems illegal to me.
Come on, Lucky. You know as well as I do that the open meeting law allows executive sessions to communicate with the city attorney in pending litigation, and it says right on the agenda that they're talking about Lyle's lawsuit.
Maybe. It just doesn't seem right. They're in there spending the public's money. The public ought to know how they're spending it and how much they're spending.
Right, Lucky. You're the taxpayer's best friend. It would be a great help for the Watertown Daily Splash to print that Abe Lincoln says we should settle for $50,000 to $75,000. That way, litigious Lyle could learn that the city is ready to pay $25,000 more than he would have eagerly grabbed. The public has a right to know, but not if that hurts the government's ability to negotiate with hostile litigants. If and when there's a settlement, you'll be the first to know.
Okay. I'll be ready to write that story.
The open meeting law allows executive sessions, but strictly limits the circumstances under which an executive session is permissible and requires proper notice on the agenda. It also requires proper procedures to enter an executive session and close the doors on what otherwise is a public meeting. In addition, Idaho Code 742062 states that exceptions to the general policy of open meetings shall be narrowly construed. And that same section makes it a violation of the open meeting law to change the subject within the executive session to one not identified within the motion to enter the executive session, or to any other topic for which an executive session is not specifically allowed. So a legitimate executive session cannot drift into other topics, or it is illegal. For all public agencies, executive sessions are permitted only for the specific purposes listed in the law. Any other discussion in executive session is prohibited. Let's thank our actors. Thank you all for participating in this session today, and thank you to all of our partners, Brian Kane, Brandon Wolf, our State Controller, Idaho Secretary of State Phil McGrain, and Chief Deputy Secretary of State Nicole Fitzgerald, the Association of Idaho Cities, the Idaho Association of Counties, Attorneys for Civic Education, and the Idaho Press Club. Please go to the IDOG website, openidaho.org, for information about upcoming events, including our November 28th Public Records Law workshop, which I'm sure will be of interest to many of you. Also, a reminder for those of you who are attorneys, if you would like to get continuing legal education credit from the Idaho State Bar, please either sign up on the list in the back of the room or email your name, email address, and bar number to idogquestions@gmail.com. All of you who registered to participate in this session today will be receiving an evaluation survey within a few minutes. Please fill it out. It helps us improve our program, and it's your chance to tell us what we can do better. Thanks again.